Isn't it? Okay. Hey guys, good to see some of you there. I didn't really know if this time would suit some of you, but I see there are a couple of you in class. Welcome. Sharon, Stephanie, good to see you guys here. Not there yet. Paddy, Karina from Austria. I hope you're feeling better. Karina, are you out of the hospital? Robbie, Robin, am I missing anyone? Spirit of 1776, good to see you as well. So if you haven't voted in the poll, please make sure that you do vote. The question is, does Van Gogh exhibit signs of depression in his letters? At the moment, 2/3 of you say yes, and sort of equal parts say no and not so far, plus minus. So we'll see what you guys think later on. But this is actually a question we want to be asking at the beginning and end of every episode. So when we deal with letters, we kind of want to, okay, Timmy. So when we deal with the letters, we kind of want to be asking this question every episode and kind of ask, was there some kind of, does Van Gogh reveal some kind of risk factor? And so we will go through that, the risk factors that he shows, and then decide where we stand with that. Maybe that's a good place to start is, what are those risk factors? So I'll put a couple of them in the chat, but the main ones are, the main risk factors for suicide are a previous suicide attempt, mental illness, such as depression. So depression is quite a big risk factor. And then also social isolation. That's kind of a big risk factor as well. Okay, so that's too many to put in there. Okay, so let's go through them. Previous suicide attempt, mental illness such as depression, social isolation. Others include criminal problems, financial problems, impulsive or aggressive tendencies, job problems or job loss, legal problems, serious illness, substance abuse disorder, right? All of those are risk factors for suicide. I would add another one, and I would say it's some major life event. Yeah, so I would add another one, which is a major life event. Now, I don't know if you just say serious illness, like you could say when you got cancer, you might feel suicidal or whatever, but I think a major life event is a major life event for a particular person. So for one person, a major life event isn't a major life event for another person. For one person, losing their job isn't a major life event. For one person, being in a relationship that doesn't work out isn't a major life event if you're a certain kind of person. Does that make sense? For one person, getting divorced is a major life event. For another person, it's not such a big deal. For one person, a major life event is maybe going bankrupt. For another person, it's not such a big deal. And so you've kind of got to figure out, is this a major life event scenario with Vincent van Gogh? It also deals with relationships. As that person had adverse childhood experiences, did that person experience bullying? Does that person have a family history of suicide? Have there been relationship problems? Has there been community problems, cultural and religious beliefs that hold that person prisoner, whatever? But then one's also got to look at protective factors. What protective factors could there be with Van Gogh, which would prevent him from committing suicide. And so some of them are, does he have coping and problem-solving skills? Does he have cultural and religious beliefs that discourage suicide? Now, bear in mind, we've just gone through a period where he is particularly, caught up in religious fervor. But now, does that continue, or is that completely discontinued? Also, does he have connections to friends, family, and community support? Does he have supportive relationships with care providers? Is there availability of physical and mental health care? Now, with Van Gogh, you might say, no, there isn't, or there wasn't very good mental health care then, but he did have access to health care at the asylum and through Dr. Gachet, right? I would also add to these a couple of others. Protective factors can be motivation levels. What's happened to Spirit of 1776? Says he cut off his ear, didn't he? When was that? That was at the end of 1888. That's something I deal with in my book, The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, where I say, I don't think he did cut off his ear. So in other words, I'm arguing that's not a, previous instance, and that's not a risk factor. But the flip side to that is if you say he did cut off his ear, so you say he was so depressed, he was so upset, he cut off his ear, then he went to an asylum for a year, and he was completely alone. He didn't see his family, he didn't have friends around him. Why wouldn't he commit suicide then? You know, why would you do it? Why wouldn't you do it then when you've cut off your ear, you're alone? Does that make sense? So I would say motivation levels are protective factors. So if you're an athlete or an artist or a business person, whatever, or a housewife, and you motivated, you actively doing something, that can be a protective thing as well. You've got a reason to live. You're showing that you've got a reason to live as well. Then also if you connect it to a sense of mission. So in his case, he had an artistic mission, but you could also be connected to a sense of having a sense of purpose in another way. It might be whatever it is. And then I would also add underlying psychology. What's your underlying psychology towards suffering? Is that, are you someone who is self-pitying? Are you someone who feels helpless, powerless? Are you someone who needs to depend on someone else? Or are you able to come up with a sense of agency? Are you in a period of self-actualization? So these are a couple that I'm adding to this. Let me just put them there as well. Paddy says Vincent had lots of family support. Well, he certainly had quite a lot here. You'll see as we go through the letters that does get less. He gets a lot of family support from his brother, which does count for a lot. Sharon says, so curious what the living conditions would have been at that asylum. I think it wouldn't have been much different from a hospital or a prison. So quite impersonal, quite Spartan, quite sort of cold, kind of a cold environment. Not a place you'd really want to be for very long. So although I'm not going to bring this up every episode, in a weird way, you kind of need to think about it at the beginning of every episode. You kind of just need to think, okay, are we dealing with a suicidal dude? Is he showing signs of depression? Does he feel sorry for himself? Through a particular episode of his letters. And then you might say, no, I didn't notice it. Okay, well, how about the next episode, right? And so you need to go on and on and on. Keep asking that question, but also keep answering it. To be honest, I'm quite surprised that 65%, 2/3 of you say that he has shown signs of depression. I, my opinion is that he doesn't. He doesn't talk endlessly about being unhappy. He doesn't talk endlessly about, he's not blaming anybody. He doesn't even say the word unhappy very, very often. The other thing to say is that he goes through some horrible experiences and he seems to come out the other side motivated, with a plan, and sort of discouraged, right? So while some of you, it seems like many of you see that he is showing signs of depression, I'm like, wow, he seemed to come out of that with a new sense of purpose. Remember, he's 27, 28 years old, so definitely is quite interesting. Let's just have a look at some of your comments. To me, it looks like a fashion statement on your jacket. Okay. Stephanie says his doctors seem to be attentive to him, at least to the thorough notes they took. Yeah, and I mean, if you think about what his doctors thought and said, Dr. Gachet described him as fully healed and didn't see much of a problem. I think it's Dr. Peyron from the asylum discharged him because he felt he was okay. So one's got to bear that in mind as well, you know, what doctors around him said. Robbie says, do you think we are just imagining how we would feel in his situation? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you guys are imagining. So what I want you to do when we go through his letters today is pay attention to the words he uses to describe things like mood and feelings. Does he say sad, unhappy, miserable, frustrated, angry, whatever, you know, negative emotions? Or does he say happy, inspired, or whatever? So in other words, just pay attention to his self-disclosure where he talks about his own feelings, right? Pay attention to it, but also pay attention to, is he overcome by his feelings, or is he quite lucid and quite sort of motivated despite hardship that he's going through, right? Just think about it in that way. Stephanie says he has some sadness, not bouts of despair, not yet anyway. The other side to that is often, you know, like if you can imagine if Vincent was completely depressed, do you think his brother would help him? And I mean this in a kind of a double way. The one is he's convincing his brother the whole time that he's got the issue under control. You know, the fact that he doesn't have a job, he's got himself under control, he's motivated, he's working, and he kind of seems to convince his brother of this for the next 16 years. He basically says, don't worry about me, I'm on it, you know, I am working, kind of thing. He doesn't say to his brother, please send me money, I can't work, I'm struggling, I haven't gotten out of bed all day. He never says that. So just bear that in mind. Nisi, good to see you here. Nisi says, only able to listen today. Thank you, Nick, and my favorite chat. Enjoy another wonderful chat today. Lovely to see you, Karina. Your time is always appreciated, Nick and Timmy. Well, Timmy, I don't know if you can see him, but he's lying on my arm, but he's almost like lying, like his head is hanging lower than my, I don't know, he's like lying in like a U shape. I don't know, it's really crazy. I'm actually going to have to put him down now because I need to open up this book. But he seems to lie in all sorts of contorted shapes when he does lie down. It's quite weird. I don't know if you guys saw the short I put on YouTube. I took him for a walk today through a nice little section. If you haven't seen it, make sure you do. Bridget says, I said no to depression. He's incredibly positive in his perspective, even in the midst of isolation, poverty, etc. He is always at the end. He leaves letters with a bright note where the lark will sing again. A very good point. That's also how I see it. I tend to agree with you, Bridget. But it's not really what I think or what Bridget thinks. It is what Vincent van Gogh actually says. We need to pay attention to that. So, Timmy, I'm going to put you down. Sorry about that. And I'm going to pick up this book. And I'm going to read from about 2 pages from this book, just to put you in the context that we need to be in. And once again, I want to show you the artworks, right? And if you have a look at these artworks, it gives you a sense of the artist at the moment. It's kind of quite dark and dreary, right? It's not recognizably Van Gogh in a sense. You know what I mean? It's not colorful and lively. It's sort of more pastoral and rural kind of thing, right? And so he's trying to find his way to full expression. So I'm reading from The Making of an Artist, page 22 to 23, and he says the following, or the book says the following: modernity and emancipation were clearly inseparable in Van Gogh's mind, and his emphatic calls for freedom were to be matched by the dazzling evolution of his art. Now, even, I'm someone who knows words and semantics, and even that to me is a little bit hard to grasp. Like, what are they actually saying there? Basically, and I mean, when you think of modernity, it's like, this is modernity, but like 150 something years ago, right? So, or even more. So, like, thinking about what is modern more than 150 years ago is quite a bit of a mind leap, if not a mind F, right? So don't think about it like that. Think about the idea of breaking free. So emancipation is quite a sort of traditional term, quite an old language, old-fashioned term, emancipation. But it's another word for freedom. So think about an artist who's trying to break free and find his way to modern expression. Now, we're not saying modern expression in terms of modern for us, for you and me, but modern for them, for them. In other words, a fresh statement, an original thought, someone who finds his way to freedom to express himself in a fresh way. That's basically in layman's terms. In other words, he needs to graduate away from this style, which is a very traditional style, right? He's got to graduate and emancipate himself from the thinking and the style of this particular way of expressing himself. And he eventually succeeds. I mean, the arc of his artistic journey is incredible. It's actually incredible to look at these images and the very first pictures that he painted, which is at the end, I think is it 1881? Yeah, at the end of 1881. To look at the very first pictures he painted and then look at the very last pictures that he painted. It's almost like chalk and cheese. It's really incredible. And it shows you to what extent a person can reinvent themselves. A person can rediscover themselves. A person can have an incredible spectrum in terms of who they are, right? And so it goes on here to say, his emphatic calls for freedom were to be matched by the dazzling evolution of his art. And there isn't really a better word than to say that. The way that his art changed from this very sort of stoic, pious sort of way of expression, to this vivid, visceral, dazzling display of color, is a triumph of his spirit and of the individual kind of thing, which is quite amazing to see. So, but they're talking here about 1881, and so they say, but he still had a long way to go. Van Gogh's first two paintings were completed at the end of 1881 under Mauve's guidance. Remember, Mauve is his sister's brother-in-law. So the two paintings he painted, the very first two paintings he painted, remember, he'd really been doing a lot of sketches and whatnot. But the first two paintings he did were Still Life with Cabbage and Clogs, as well as Still Life with Beer Mug and Fruit. I think it's on page 9. So let me show you these artworks. Okay, one more. So these are the first two paintings that Van Gogh did, and they're from 1881, right? So you can see it's got that very somber, dark kind of background, right? So it's Still Life with Cabbage and Clogs, and Still Life with Beer Mug and Fruit. So I'm going to read a little bit further from this, but remember the question that we're asking. The question we've asked is, does Van Gogh exhibit signs of depression in his letters, right? And I think a clever way to look through that question or to examine that question is to say, well, what about his art? Does his art become depressed? Does his art show signs of depression? And I think the unambiguous answer to that is, well, what do you guys think it is? If you just look at the arc of his art in one fell swoop, in a very simple way, from these sort of dark, shadowy, waterlogged themes to the sunny, the vigorous, sunshiny, electric, living, rippling scenes. Do you think it's becoming more depressed, or do you think it's becoming more alive and lively? What do you think the answer is to that? Paddy says, pretty amazing for a first effort. Stephanie says, shadows of still life, then light in the landscapes. Ricardo Ortiz, good to see you. I've noticed that most early work of fine artists starts with tight lines, then images get wider and loose. Hi, everyone. Spirit of 1776 says, not much electric lighting in those days. True, but there is the sun that's shining. The sun is shining then. Not there yet says, art was his outlet. I actually like some of the dark images. Okay, so let me read a bit further. Vincent's first steps as a painter were hesitant, tentative. He chose inanimate subjects as he had been taught at the academy and tried to establish three-dimensionality and effects of light in a casual arrangement of the objects he had picked. The background remained a non-spatial brown. This approach was not a particularly good idea since it afforded the individual items no optical purchase. What he's kind of saying there is that by putting his objects into this brown context, they are kind of lost. They're kind of lost in a kind of a murkiness, right? Although it's a strong classical veneer. It's not really anything new in artistic sense, and it's not easy to say something new in this murky scenario. I quite like the way the guy describes it as non-spatial brown. And then he says, but Van Gogh had made a start, and in the rustic simplicity, also a great way of putting it, in the rustic simplicity with which he took so obdurate, such a stubborn subject as clogs for granted, we sense a foretaste of the scenes of peasant life that Van Gogh was to paint in the years ahead. And that is true. In the coming years, in the next, especially the next 2-3 years, he would paint a lot of peasants. He'd paint peasants picking potatoes. He'd paint peasants working with loom as weavers, and they were very hardworking people. And so that idea that he so loved, that Dickensian setup of like a pilgrim, of someone who's poor and struggling, that was something that continued to fascinate him, and it was all around him. And so he would continue to depict figures in this kind of murkiness. And then it says, now it talks about Van Gogh's early models. In a distinctly new way, Vincent van Gogh's art was a product of the industrial era. Just think about those words. Now, you must bear in mind, at the time Van Gogh comes onto the scene, right? Certainly in terms of the art scene, it's 1880. And what's starting to happen in the industrial world is industrialization. It's not something that was always there. Steam engines haven't always been there. Bicycles haven't always been there. Building, this is like 10 or 20 years before the Model T Ford, right? The whole industrial apparatus of the world is starting to get its start, right? The Eiffel Tower hasn't been built yet. Engineering is starting to find its way, right? Photography is something that is coming into existence, right? And so this is the world that Van Gogh kind of is born into. So it's a similar revolutionary phase as when men went to the moon in rockets, spaceships or rocket ships. In the 70s, that was a revolutionary phase. When the internet became a thing, that was a revolutionary phase. And we're kind of in a revolutionary phase right now with social media and technology, smartphone technology and all that kind of thing. But the point is that he was in a period of an industrial era that had an impact on his art. And I think one of the impacts was that he painted very quickly. It was normal for artists to take a long time to paint, and he suddenly painted very quickly. In that sense, I identify a little bit with Van Gogh, because I also when I wrote my 101 books, I wrote them very, very quickly. I sometimes wrote a book in 10 days, and you might laugh at that and say, well, it must have been a crappy book, but it was pretty well edited, spell checked, a pretty high standard of writing for such a short time. It was written, published, and available in about 2 weeks, whereas in the past, something like that could take a year or 2 years. And so my writing, in the same way my writing was impacted by the internet and the speed of the internet and the speed of information transfer, his art was impacted to some extent by photography and the industrialized world, right? And the way that happened is a way that is really fascinating. So let me read a bit further. So you might say, so how is his art actually impacted by this? I mean, if he was painting rural scenes, what did a factory scenario have to do with his art? You might say, if he's painting potatoes or a peasant, what the heck does a factory scenario have to do with that? well, the impact is actually quite fascinating, right? Quite surprising. So they say here, the 19th century had embraced the idea of industrial progress with enthusiasm. The multiplication of things was seen as the foundation of a better world, and works of the visual arts became subject to the process of reproduction too. So did you catch that? The art world, artistic things such as things that had been previously only owned by very wealthy people, like certain kinds of white crockery and china, right, now became something that almost not everyone could afford, but became affordable to many. But in particular in the art world, suddenly, because of books and printing and being able to print things on prints, suddenly you could have access to, you could see artworks in a way that you could never see before. In other words, you simply knew about art in a way artists never, you had access to art and you knew about art and you could see it in ways that weren't possible previously. It's a little bit like the artistic, and I know it's maybe a silly comparison, but it's a little bit like the artistic version of the Johnny Depp trial, where suddenly the cameras go in and everyone has access to the finer details of their lives, right? It's that same kind of exposure that artists are now getting to other artists. It leads to just a much deeper level of appreciation and knowledge and the evolution of art, which is exactly what happens. Anyway, he says, and works of the visual arts became subject to the process of reproduction too. Art was stored in museums, accessible to the public, and private homes had prints and books so that quiet hours of leisure could also be spent in the pursuit of art. Did you pick that up? Although you have artworks hanging in museums, you can also see them in books, right? And you can see them in prints hanging in homes. And so suddenly you don't need to just go to a museum. You can find art everywhere. To a great extent than any painter before him, this is so important, to a great extent than any painter before him, Van Gogh underwent his training as an artist by looking at reproductions. It was as if the autodidact needed to school his eye on the smooth impersonality of mass-produced print work if his vision was to discover the living and universal qualities in man and nature. And this is also a fascinating insight. Goupil, Van Gogh's early employer, was the leading name in art reproduction. Did you guys know that? So he worked for a company that kind of specialized and was the leader in art prints, right? It says, definite as Van Gogh was about severing ties with his past, he continued to take pleasure in the reproductions Goupil published. Confident of his ability to acquire artistic skill from prints and drawing schools, he soon quit the Brussels Academy, although it was free, which had been his only reason for matriculating there in the first place. In his view, it was enough if he diligently copied reproductions and then let the fruits of his labor ripen in the warm glow of nature. Isn't that well put? That he diligently copied these reproductions, he kind of got comfortable and familiar with the style, and then he allowed his oeuvre to ripen in the warm glow of nature, whatever that was. He found himself he found his voice, he found this fresh expression in nature. And then it talks here about Van Gogh's tutor was Charles Bargue, Bargue's Cours des and Exercises au Fossein, 2 volumes of drawing exercises for study at home, published by Goupil, took the place of the academy in Van Gogh's training. Van Gogh tackled both sections repeatedly. Indeed, he had amused himself in this way every day during his Borinage sojourn. The engravings, okay, I'm not going to really read too much more than this. But it's really interesting how art reproductions were, in a weird way, part of Van Gogh's education, right? But he had extraordinary access to a wide array of art and artists, and that kind of led him to realize what had been done and what he wanted to do. And I think that's why, in a way, Van Gogh's art is so progressive, or was so progressive for that time. He was actually kind of a innovator. He was kind of the Afrikaans word is baanbreker, which means someone who, what's the word? It's funny, I can't think of the English name for that. It's kind of like a pioneer, but I'm trying to think of a better word. Yeah, pioneer. It's probably the best way to say that. Baanbreker, if you translate that directly, it's almost like lane breaker. So someone who breaks out of the lane or breaks off the track that they're on. So it's kind of quite interesting. Okay, so let's have a look at some of your comments. Yeah, Corinna talks about the Japanese prints. Bridget says it's a beautifully written book. Who is the author? Rainer Metzger and Ingo F. Walther. And I think it's just called Van Gogh. I don't know if you'll easily get hold of it because it was written on some kind of 25-year anniversary. Rainer Metzger and Ingo F. Walther, Vincent van Gogh, 1853 to 1890. Here's another picture of him. Okay. Okay, so that part's done. Let's just have a look at some of your comments. He's often carried away with new skills and development, ways of thinking, and so on. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm about to go to the letters, but before I do that, I want to touch on 8 stolen artworks that are still missing, right? Now, remember in the last episode, we dealt with 15 artworks, 15 of the most expensive paintings that were auctioned, right? Remember that? In the last sort of couple of weeks. Now we're going to look at 8 stolen artworks that are still missing, and also kind of how much they're worth and what they look like. So this is the first one. Hope you guys can see it. Oh, damn. Something tells me it's just too much. It's not really allowing me to share it. Okay, so let me just put the link to this in the... Okay, so if you guys follow that link, unfortunately I can't show you these artworks individually because the links are too long. But the first one is actually Van Gogh. So when they're talking about these 8 stolen artworks that are still missing, the first one is Poppy Flowers by Vincent van Gogh. It's a painting from 1887. So it's before he goes to Arles. It's one of the last paintings he paints while he's still in Paris. Now, what I want you to notice is just how colorful that painting is compared to the ones we've looked at, compared to the Cabbage and Clogs, compared to the Beer Mug. Although there's still that brownness in it, it's definitely got a lot more color than the ones that we've seen. And this is at the end of his Paris period. When he leaves Paris, his art's going to take on even more incredibly expressive components. It's almost even unrecognized from that. So the part that I want to emphasize here is that they describe this as the world's most famous art theft that took place in Paris on August 21, 1911. And it says here, an employee at Paris's Louvre Museum hid in a broom cupboard and waited until the museum closed. In the depth of the night, he crept out of his hiding place and snatched the Mona Lisa from the wall. This guy, Perugia, was 29 at the time, and he kept Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece in a trunk in his apartment in Florence for the next 2 years. So they describe the theft of the Mona Lisa as the most famous art theft ever. So who would have thought of art as being part of true crime, but it very much is part of it. I'm not going to go through the others. I'm going to go just through the next one, which is Poppy Flowers, the second one that's listed. And the story is quite interesting. They say the painting was stolen from the Muhammad Mahmud Khalil Museum in Cairo in August 2010, so about 12 years ago. This painting is also valued at about $50 million and was painted in 1887. And then they actually found this painting. So it was stolen, and then they recovered it. Oh, hang on, sorry, that's not true. They thought they'd recovered it, but they hadn't. So actually what took place was this painting was stolen once, recovered, and then stolen again, and it remains missing. They say it was previously stolen from that same museum on June 4th, 1977. So it was stolen June 4th, 1977, recovered in 1987, and then stolen again about 20 years after that, in August 2010, and it's still missing today. So it's quite interesting how it works. It's stolen, they get it back, gets stolen. But you almost constantly hear about Vincent van Gogh artworks that are stolen. There's also something by Pablo Picasso that's mentioned here, Portrait of a Young Man by Raphael, Rembrandt, picture that's also stolen, Caravaggio. I'm not going to go through all of this as well, but it just lists, as you can see there, the top artworks that are stolen by, that have been stolen. There's also Charing Cross Bridge by Monet. So, quite interesting. So from here, we're going to kind of go into the letters, and then hopefully, if there's time, I want to deal with something that really fascinated me. It's kind of like breaking news. So again, you might think, how can there be breaking news on something that happened 150 years ago? Well, there's something that has just come out based on the Van Gogh family's real feelings towards Gauguin, and I think that's something that's going to really surprise you guys. I thought it was fascinating, so I'm looking forward to sharing that with you guys. Robbie says, I like Poppy Flowers, but the frame maybe drowns it. It's quite an ornate frame. Not there, it says, visited the Louvre many years ago. Can you believe it? I haven't. I've been outside. I've been sort of right where those glass pyramids are. I've never been actually inside. I've been to Paris quite a few times. I just haven't had enough time. One of the first times I went there, I definitely didn't have enough money. But I think I really owe it to myself to go again and just make sure that I do that kind of thing. Bridget says, okay. Okay, so Stephanie, are you still around? Do you want the link to the letter we're going to go through? Touring takes a lot of time, yeah. I also don't know, I don't know if I've ever stayed overnight in Paris in a hotel. I've stayed overnight in Paris where I slept in a park. I slept kind of under the Eiffel Tower, but I don't think I've ever actually slept like any normal person in Paris in a hotel. That, I guess, is the next thing I need to do. Stephanie says, I'm looking for the book. What book? Oh, that book. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're going to easily find it in print. Okay, so now we're going to go to the letters. As I said, I'm going to take you guys through some brand new research, which is going to hopefully blow your socks off. Okay, so here we go. You guys ready? Bridget says, I'm quite intrigued by family's view on Gauguin. Yeah, we're going to get to that. Karina says, you should only go look at a few things in the Louvre and not too much. Yeah, I was actually outside more than one museum, but I'll talk to you guys about that another time. Okay, so again, just a reminder, as we go through these letters, ask yourself, does this guy sound depressed? Not like every sentence, but like, was he depressed in that letter? Next letter, was he depressed in that letter? Is he expressing negative emotions? Does he sound helpless? Does he sound sad? Does he sound like he's blaming someone? Does he sound frustrated? What's coming through, like what's the general tone that's coming through in his letters? Just ask yourself that question, address it, answer it, and think about it, just in your own mind. Okay, so here we go. Let me just put a link to the relevant artworks. This is actually not bad. So this is some of the art that he was sketching at the time of this letter. So the one is called Marsh with Water Lilies. The other one is a portrait of, they say, possible portrait of Wilhelmine, his sister. So could be that. But basically it's a portrait of a woman. Okay, so here we go. Dear Theo, this is from Eton, June 1881. It's not like got a specific date, but it's summer 1881. Dear Theo, it is time that you heard from me again. You must know that Rappard, that wealthy artist, has been here for about 12 days and now he has gone. Of course, he sends his best regards. We have taken many long walks together, have been, for instance, several times to the heath near Seppe, to the so-called Passifart, a big swamp. There, Rappard painted a large study, 1 meter by 50 centimeters, so 1 meter by half a meter, which is about the size of the picture behind me, in which there was much that was good. Beside that, he did about 10 small sepias, also in the Lisbos. While he was painting, I made a drawing in pen and ink of another spot in the swamp where all the water lilies grow near to the road to Roosendaal. There's actually a place called Roosendaal here in South Africa, funnily enough, little town. I think the sketch that he includes there is actually the spot that he's talking about there. He says, we also went to Plissenhagen together, but Uncle was ill in bed again. I think Rappard makes progress in his work, but from what he told me, he has got a nicely furnished studio at home. Now this week he's going to Loosdrecht, where he intends to stay a month. He too works regularly, and that's emphasized. He too works regularly and hard. So he's obviously impressed by this guy's work ethic. Okay, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this, but he writes, I bought Casagna's Trait d'Aquarelle and studying it, even if I should not make any watercolors. He says, even if I should not make any watercolors, I shall probably find many things, I think it should be things in it, for instance, about sepia and ink. For until now, I've drawn exclusively in pencil accented and worked up by the pen, sometimes a reed pen, which is a broader stroke. What I've been doing lately demanded that way of working because the subjects required much drawing, and that's emphasized. Drawing in perspective too, for instance. A few workshops in the village here, a forge, a carpenter shop, and a workshop of a maker of wooden shoes. Then he says, Wilhelmina's left now, and I'm sorry, she poses very well. I made a drawing of her and of another girl who stayed here. So that drawing that we saw, it seems like it could be his sister, but then he also mentions another girl. So it could be one or the other. But it seems likely that it is her since he mentions her. Then he says, I put a sewing machine into that drawing. Nowadays, there are no more spinning wheels, and it is a great pity for painters and draftsmen. But something has come in its place that is no less picturesque, and that is the sewing machine. So there is a hint at the industrial era that's sort of playing out in the background of these rural settings. So in the past, there would be a spinning wheel, and now that's being replaced by a sewing machine. In the past, there would be a horse on a cart. Now that's being replaced by the first cars. We're not quite there yet, but that's what will happen. You would have horses pulling plows, or cows, oxen, whatever, pulling plows. That'll be replaced with tractors, right? That's all how that is all going to change the fabric of the countryside. Then he says, what about your coming here this summer? Is there any chance of it really happening? I hope so. Rappard seems to have a boat of his own there at Loosdrecht. That must be fine. So this guy's obviously pretty wealthy. He's got his own studio, he's got his own boat, seems to be pretty well off. So it shows you in that time you could, I think, be quite wealthy as an artist, right? Then he says, from Loosdrecht, he intends to go to Gelderland. I would very much like to meet you, and I promised him that if you came and I knew it beforehand, I should let him know, because he would then try to arrange to meet you. So you can see how Vincent's trying to kind of arrange that his brother, who's an art dealer, meets Rappard, who's kind of his pal, and he's trying to get networks going. So it could be good for Rappard, it could be good for his brother, and if things go well for his brother, things kind of go well for him, right? Corinna, good point. You said there is his embrace of modernity. Well said. Bridget says, it must have been an incredible time to live, such huge advances in machinery. I agree with you, but I think any time people have been alive in the last many decades must have been pretty incredible. I mean, when I was 7 years old, TV became a reality. So it was like no TV. And I remember very vividly, I remember sitting at a friend's house who had a TV and we didn't, and just looking at the test pattern for hours. So there was just like a test pattern, and then all you saw on it was a clock. And then suddenly, after like many hours, the test pattern would become people, and it would be sort of someone reading the news. And we were like, wow, that's incredible, right? And then, I think it was only like, you only got about 2 hours of television, then went back to the test pattern kind of thing. But you nevertheless sat and had the test pattern on all the time kind of thing. This is obviously years and years before the 24-hour news cycle and whatnot. Also, we'll never forget when CNN suddenly appeared on TV in South Africa. It was like without an announcement. It wasn't like someone said, turn on your TV and you can watch CNN. It was just like one day it was there. And we were like, wow, thanks. And then there it was. It's some things that I don't know if you would know in America, that you could be somewhere else in the world and suddenly you've got CNN on your TV. It's like, oh, okay. And I remember watching Stuart Varney and Deborah Marchini. And I think that was around about the time of the Gulf War. And so I would like go to university, come home, and sort of just before lunch was ready, watch Stuart Varney and Deborah Marchini. I still thought Deborah Marchini was so stunning. I don't know if you guys, I don't know, Stephanie, I don't know if you remember those news reporters from CNN. True Jedi Forever says, I remember thinking, how could they possibly have something to talk about for 24 hours? You know what? I don't know if that's even true now. Often, a lot of what you see in the news cycle is repeated over and over again. There's not really much that changes. I know when I was watching the coverage of the war in Ukraine, it was like, when's the next cycle? You know, when are we going to come out of this? Okay, so let's wrap up this letter. Spirit of 1776 says, in the 1880s, the advancements filtered in little by little and likely less into rural areas. Sharon says, I remember CNN back in the beginning. I remember when like a supermarket was like a big deal. It was like there was a lot of unhappiness about it, that supermarkets were going to crush these little grocery stores, and that's exactly what happened. But I remember when supermarkets was like this completely new thing. Anyway, so he goes on to say, I do not know whether he, this is Rappard, intends to go back to Paris. He did not speak of it at all, nor do I know if this is a sign that he does not think about it or that. On the contrary, il couvre son projet. He hatches his plans. I don't know if I've said that right. When I think that he's only 23 years old and more things of that sort, I should not be surprised if the latter were the case. Well, is Rappard only 23? My impression was that he was like 50. He says, I hope you will write me if you can spare a moment. If you could by any chance send me the Salon's catalogue, I should be greatly obliged to you. Rappard told me he was going to buy all Cassagne's books. He has trouble with his perspective, and in other words, Rappard has trouble with his perspective, and I know of no better remedy for this ailment. At least, if I am quite cured of it, I shall have those books to thank for it. That is to say, I put into practice the theory they contain. However, practice is a thing one cannot buy along with books. If that were so, there would be a larger sale of them, I suppose. And now adieu, with a handshake, yours sincerely, Vincent. At this time, he's 28 years old. So ask yourself, does he sound depressed in that letter? Does he sound helpless? Does he sound miserable, right? Now, letter from Vincent to Theo. This is a month later, also from Etten. It's written in July. And I'm just going to show you this picture that he did. Also not bad. Of it's called The Edge of the Wood. So obviously what you want to take note of is when he does have a setback, how does he deal with it? Does he recover quickly? Does he become mired in misery? Does he act rashly? Is he emotional? Does he become unhinged? That's the other side, is when he does have a setback, how does he deal with it? Okay, so, and then there's another pretty horrible portrait here. Actually, it's not that bad. It's so-so, I guess. Jacob Mayer's daughter. Okay. Okay, so let's get busy with that letter. So he says, Dear Theo, in your last letter, you wrote there is a good chance of your coming to Holland pretty soon. Remember, he's in Paris, right? I'm very glad because I'm looking forward to seeing you. Now I know that you are coming. I think it even more unnecessary to send you a few things. Perhaps I might have if you were not coming, so that you might see my drawing do not get any worse. See my drawings do not get any worse, though they are far from what they ought to be. Well, you will see for yourself what is in them when you come. In my last letter I wrote about the salon's catalogue. I did so to remind you of it in case you might be able to get one. Of course, if need be, I can do very well without it. It is not a necessity of life. So he kind of gently reminds his brother what he needs, and then also kind of says, no pressure kind of thing. Yeah, it doesn't look very feminine. Then he says, but there's another thing which is a necessity, and when you come, and if it is not too difficult for you to carry, bring some with you then. I mean, white ingress paper. I bought some of it from Brussels and worked on it with pleasure, and it is very well suited to pen drawing, especially for a reed pen. Now I have been without it for quite a time, and here I can only get smooth paper without any grain. So ingress paper, it's sort of got a texture to it. And so if you use, I guess, I'm not sure if it's watercolor or charcoal, but basically because it's kind of got a texture, it's easier to create texture, to create those sort of not hashtags, but those sort of grid lines that show shadow and that sort of thing. Anyway, it goes on to say, now I have been without it for quite a while, quite a time, and here I can only get smooth paper without any grain, unless I take Watman or Harding, but that is too expensive for sketches. The English paper costs 10 centimes a sheet, I think. Well, try your best to put as large a package of it as you can in your bag, and you will give me more pleasure than with anything else. So again, yeah, you kind of got to ask yourself, does he really want to see his brother? Is he like really looking forward to his brother visiting? Or does he want his brother to get something for him? Or is it both? He wants to see his brother and he wants something to come out of that, right? Bridget says, would you show us one of your drawings, paintings one day? I will. Stephanie says, yes, the luxury of a cell phone with my boy's activities. How lovely he has started to ask for materials. I was actually thinking of doing an artwork that I've had in my mind. I was kind of, just the other day, I was visualizing the picture. I've sort of had a picture I've been meaning to do for quite a while. Maybe I should try and execute it while I'm still doing this series. It is quite influenced by Van Gogh's expressionism. The whole idea is to be expressive and for it to sort of pulsate. So we'll see what I can come up with. Then he says, I've made another drawing in the Lichtbosch, and now it has become quite hot, too hot to sit on the heath by day. So I work at home now and I'm copying the drawings of Holbein from the bogs. That's something that was mentioned in this book. Remembering what you told me once, I've tried to draw a few portraits after photographs, and I think that is good practice. So that's another way where this industrial process is intruding on the art process. He's able to draw portraits from photos. That's something previous artists simply weren't able to do. And that's also where the artist is challenged in a way that's quite unique, is looking at a portrait and saying, well, a portrait can capture your lightness. So what is an artist to do to show something beyond the portrait, right? And that is, I think, a big question Van Gogh asked himself, challenged himself on, and answered. Makes sense. Think about it. If you can take a photo of someone, then what is the point of having your portrait painted? Well, the artist needs to address that question and answer it. I've got to say, in a weird way, I come from the opposite school, where someone who's from an artistic family. I'm someone who is quite autistic. I had art at school. Wish I could have taken further, but it was only available for a while. I was, the best artist in my class at school. But what's my point? After blowing my trumpet, I sort of felt like photography is a much better way for me to capture a beautiful landscape, a beautiful nature scene, than trying to go to the effort to draw it. And I would often see my brother take a photo of something and then draw it and say, that's art. And I would be the opposite. I'd say, well, I see something that's incredibly beautiful, take a photo of it, now that's art. That photograph is art. In other words, the reverse of the artistic process in a way. You know what I mean? And I think that is a thing that artists then and now are challenged with, is how can you add value to simply seeing what is in front of you? Because painting something that's realistic is hardly when you can take a photo. That's why I like Keith Alexander's art so much, because it's realism with a twist. He paints these incredible desert scapes that are to some extent fictional, to some extent fantasy. And that's what I have in my home, Keith Alexander type art. Then he says, as I asked you before, write whenever you can and receive a handshake in thought, Vincent. And okay, so that's that letter. Now we go to August. I think November, December is a lot of letters just in that section. Dear Theo, it is very pleasant to have you here again, so you did come and visit, and to have long walks together about everything. I always regret that we cannot be together much more. Not that I think talking in itself so valuable, but I mean that I wish we knew each other better and more intimately than we do now. That thought occurred to me, especially when coming back from Roosendaal after seeing you off at the station. Also with regard to some things we said that last moment at the station. So you kind of get the sense that he is quite a lonely guy, that when he sees his brother, it does mean a lot to him. You've also got to ask, does he have any friends in Eton? Does he have any friends his age or whatever? And the answer seems to be no. He says, I'm glad to see in the letter I got today that you hope to come back before very long. Of course, I feel quite better now. The day after you left, I stayed in bed, however, and had a long talk with Dr. van Gent, a clever and practical man. Not because I thought this insignificant malaise important, but rather because in general, either well or unwell, I like to talk with the doctor now and then in order to know that everything is all right. If one occasionally hears a sound and true word about health, by and by one gets much clearer ideas about it. And if one knows what to do and what to avoid, one is not shaken like a reed by every wind and does not believe all the nonsense so often heard about health and ill health. What do you think that language says about his attitude to illness? Is he a baby? Is he someone who, when he gets the sniffles, he just stays in bed? Is he someone who, if he doesn't feel great, just does nothing? He talks about not believing the nonsense so often heard about health and ill health, right? Then he says, for the rest, I'm drawing the exercises of Hussein on the ingress paper you brought with you. It is difficult enough. It is much more inspiring to draw from nature than to copy such a page from the bogs. But still, I set myself the task of drawing them once more, and now for the last time. It would not be right if I paid too much attention to details and overlooked the great things when drawing from nature. And that was too much the case in my last drawings, I thought. Therefore, I want to study Bog's method again. He gives only broad lines and forms and simple, delicate outlines. And for the moment, I've stopped drawing outdoors. When I go back to it shortly, I shall have a better view of things than before. It says here, I do not know if you ever read English books. If you do, I can strongly recommend that you read Shirley by Cura Bell, author of another book called Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre wasn't written by Cura Bell. It must have been the nom de plume used at the time. Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre. Just want to see if she used Cura Bell as a nom de plume. Interestingly, Charlotte and Emily traveled to Brussels at one point. There we go. First publication. Averse to personal publicity, we veiled our own names under those of Cura, Ellis, and Acton Bell, the ambiguous choice being dictated by a sort of conscientious scruple at assuming Christian names positively masculine. So there you go. So if you want to have a look at the cover of the book, this is what it looked like. Any of you guys read Jane Eyre? I think we had it prescribed at school. Pretty good book. Sky Kerrigan, good to see you. My sister loves that book and has read it several times, Jane Eyre. Okay. So you can see he's not just he's not just articulate in the ways of art and religion, but also literature, which I think is quite interesting. So he is a very modern fellow because he's reading modern literature, right? Sharon Tuck says, love Jane Eyre. Margaret Sabinski, thanks so much. Bridget says, yes, at school too. Robbie Robbins says, Jane Eyre is wonderful. Then he says, it is as beautiful as pictures by Malay or Bouton or Hercoma. So he's basically saying, reading Jane Eyre, reading the descriptions in there, reading the scenes is as beautiful as pictures. Isn't that a lovely sentiment? I know when I was a little boy, I read Enid Blyton and the scenes of Karen Island and Karen Cottage and the lighthouse, they were like these incredible portraits, very simple portraits, but very, very clear in my mind. And reading those books made me want to go to England. And then, of course, when I got there, I couldn't find those portraits really. They really should have a Enid Blyton tour through England, something like that. Robbie Robbins said, love the famous five. But then there was a TV series that kind of addressed my pining and longing for it. Unfortunately, I was, I think, well into my 20s when it came out. But anyway, that is actually why I called Timmy Timmy. Timmy got his name from the famous five, the name that they gave their dog. Okay, so he goes on to say, I wish all people had what I'm gradually beginning to acquire, the power to read a book in a short time without difficulty and to keep a strong impression of it. In reading books, as in looking at paintings, one must admire what is beautiful with assurance, without doubt, without hesitation. It's quite an interesting sentiment. I wish all people had what I'm gradually beginning to acquire, the power to read a book in a short time without difficulty. So what he's communicating there is his focus, is his incredible powers of concentration. is his incredible ability to push aside distraction and be completely keyed into something, right? Then he says, I'm busy rearranging all my books. I've read too much not to work on systematically to get at least an idea of modern literature. Sometimes I'm so sorry that I do not know more about history, especially modern history. Well, being sorry and giving up doesn't help us on. The only thing to do is to push forward. So, although it's not really what we're talking about, but he does talk about here being sorry and giving up doesn't help us. That's giving you an insight into his attitude towards self-pity and whatever, right? In the previous letter, what did he say about illness, or was it this letter? This letter, he talks about I don't believe all the nonsense about ill health. So he's not a hypochondriac. He's not someone who's going to get overcome by anxiety, right? You must remember one of the biggest things he's got to deal with in his life is uncertainty. The uncertainty of, as an artist, he doesn't have a regular job, he doesn't have a proper employer, he doesn't really have a home, he doesn't have all of those accoutrements that most people with regular jobs have. He doesn't have a family. So part of what is associated with that is uncertainty. And what is absolutely associated with uncertainty is anxiety. And so the question is, does Van Gogh learn how to manage his anxiety? And if the answer is yes, then it means he's not likely to be suicidal. Someone who's suicidal is someone who becomes overwhelmed by anxiety. It's similar. You must think of suicide as the murder of self. And it's not that different from the murder of someone else. Someone who murders someone else is also overcome by anxiety. It's like, if I don't murder this person, I'm going to lose control. If I don't do this, it's more frightening than if I do this, right? And so it's a form of taking control of anxiety. So suicide is the form of taking control of anxiety. Of course, if you can take control of your anxiety in another way, then you don't need to do that, right? That's why I say, if somebody else cut his ear off and then he recovers from that, imagine that someone cuts your ear off and then you're alone for a year and you recover from that. Isn't that proof actually that you're really good at dealing with disaster instead of the opposite? Sky says, I wonder how close he was to his other siblings. Well, at this point, I think he's kind of living with them, is sort of sharing space, not with all of them, but with some of them. Then he says, I was very glad to detect now and then in your talk some very good philosophy. Who knows what a great thinker you may become in time. If you think Illusions Perdues by Balzac too long, 2 volumes, then try Le Père Goriot. Only 1 volume. Once you've tried Balzac, you'll prefer him to many others. Remember Balzac's nickname, the veterinary of incurable diseases. By the time I've finished the bogs, it'll be autumn. That is a delightful time for drawing. I wish that Rapard would come back here then. I think I shall find a good model here in Piet Kaufman, the gardener, but I think it will be better to let him pose with a spade or plow or something like that, not here at home, but either in the yard or in his own home or in the field. But what a tough job it is to make people understand how to pose. Folks are desperately obstinate about it, and it is hard to make them yield on this point. They only want to pose in their Sunday best, with impossible folds in which neither knees, elbows, shoulder blades, nor any other part of the body have left their characteristic dents or bumps. Indeed, that is one of the small miseries of a draftsman's life. So, yeah, he talks about misery. He talks about something that's frustrating him, and he's saying, you know what it is? It's these ordinary blue-collar folk who refuse to pose in like their work clothes. They're insisting on posing in their Sunday best, and because they posing in their Sunday best, he can't like even see their bodies because there's just like all this clothing. And I don't know, I find that actually quite funny. It's quite amusing that it's like, can you please pose holding this spade? And they're like, no, I'm going to get into my suit and I'll stand kind of like this. And it's like, no, I don't want that. And they're like, no, I don't want to do this other thing, kind of thing. Spirit of 1776 says autographed books with lithographs. Stephanie, why did you retract your message? Anyway, okay. Stephanie says, I wonder if they had letters from Vincent. You mean from Theo? Anyway, he says, well, adieu, write when you can and receive a handshake in thought from yours sincerely, Vincent. Okay. So he refers to this painting. It's the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp by Rembrandt, painted in 1632. As far as I know, this is also a picture my brother copied as quite a young artist. And I think he did it because Van Gogh did it. So this is written August, September 1881. Dear Theo, I've just come back from a trip to The Hague. I'm home alone tonight as father and mother are still at Prinsenhagen. So it is a good opportunity to tell you about everything. I left here Tuesday and now it is Friday night. At the Hague, I went to see Mr. Teerstig, Mauve, and De Bock. Mr. Teerstig was very kind. Remember, he was a little bit worried that Teerstig kind of wasn't very positively inclined towards him. He said, I thought he had made progress, as I had again copied the whole series of exercises off Hussein, 1 to 60. I brought them with me, and it was especially in reference to them that he made the remark, he at least attaches some value to my making them, also to my occasionally copying a figure by Millet, Bouton, or others. So this is a picture he did, windmills near Dordrecht, and I think it's pretty good. Of all the pictures he's done so far, I think this is the best. I wonder whether you guys agree. Of all the artworks we've seen so far, don't you think this is the nicest thus far? Then he says, I spent an afternoon and part of an evening with Mauve and saw many beautiful things in his studio. My own drawing seemed to interest Mauve more. He gave me a great many hints, which I was glad to get, and have arranged to come back to see him in a relatively short time when I have some new studies. So I remember as quite a young guy, late teens, early 20s, we sometimes went to visit my great uncle. So it's my grandmother's brother, my famous grandfather's great-grandfather's son. He also was quite a well-known painter, and so we would go to his mansion. He also had a boat. He was pretty wealthy, had a Rolls Royce, and he would always brag about his wealth. It was like quite creepy, and he was very narcissistic. He was always talking about himself. He was always sort of saying how great he was. And it actually got worse as he got older. But he would also sometimes be very kind, and he would draw a picture especially for us. And I kept mine maybe for 20 odd years, and then I'm not quite sure what happened to it. Yeah. Anyway, so Van Gogh's doing the same thing. He's going to see other artists and talking to them and getting a sense of what's going on. Then he says he thinks I should start painting now. So after all this time, all these sketches and drawings and everything, Merv is saying, dude, start painting. And that leads then to the cabbages and clogs and the beer mug and the whatever. What's with the beer mug and fruit? That leads to those first two paintings from this point onwards. So it's quite interesting how long he spends kind of studying before he actually starts painting for the first time. He says, I enjoyed meeting De Bock. I was at his studio. He's painting a large picture of the dunes, which has much that is fine in it. Sorry, but in my opinion, the fellow must practice drawing figures in order to produce even finer things. Okay. Timmy, what have you done? Timmy, don't kick the keyboard. It seems to me he has a real artist temperament and that we have not heard the last of him. He raves about Millet and Corot, but didn't these two work hard on figures, yes or no? Carrot's figures aren't so well known as his landscapes, but it cannot be denied that he has done them. So I'm not going to read the rest there. Then he says, then I went to see Mestach's panorama with him. It is a work that deserves all respect. It reminded me of a remark, I think by Berger, about the anatomy lesson by Rembrandt. This picture's only fault is that it has no fault. The three drawings by Mestach at the exhibition had perhaps more faults, but aroused immediate sympathy, at least so with me. I don't really like that the picture I've showed you because I think it's bad quality. Let's see if I can share a better image of the anatomy lesson, because it is quite an awesome painting. Have a look at this. Have a look at this. Now, what I think is so amazing about this image is it's actually a painting. It kind of looks like it could be a photo. Look at the quality of the light. Look at the quality of facial expressions. It's actually quite astonishing. Look at the hands. Look at the hands of the doctor. Look at the hand of the unfortunate dude lying there. It's quite incredible. What's also quite amazing is if you bear in mind that this was painted in 1632, it's not in like a hospital, or it's like not a modern hospital. It's not using electric lighting. And so if you look at the background, you know, the walls that are in the background, even the detail there is really done really, really well. And it just shows a very, very high level of artistic execution. And it's no wonder that Vincent says this picture's only fault is that it has no fault. Quite an interesting comment to make there. Stephanie says, oh, wow, that does show more crisp detail. Yeah. So that is a great painting to copy, to test your ability to challenge your different expressions, capturing all the anatomical challenges that an artist has in terms of hands, ears, nose, eyes, feet, light on all of this, and so on. Anyway, he goes on to say, speaking of the exhibition, there was a splendid drawing by Israel's sewing class at Katwijk, Mauve, a plough, sheep in the dunes, and then a single figure, a laborer resting in the field at twilight. Arts had three drawings there, if I remember correctly. A scene in an almshouse, which I think is like a, not a brewery, but like a bar. Old men and women eating porridge, very important, very well and seriously done. Also 2 studies of heads, full of character, a man and woman from Scheveningen. Among Wissenbruch's was a drawing of water lilies, so simple, so full of style, of understanding and love that many drawings by others were lost beside it. Sure, how long does this still go on? He talks about, I stayed in The Hague until Thursday morning. Then I went to Dordrecht because from the train, I'd seen a spot I wanted to draw, a row of windmills. Though it was raining, I managed to finish it. And so at least I had a souvenir from my little trip. So you see what a dedicated artist he is, even though it's rainy, here he is painting in the rain. So you can see this guy is the makings of a great artist, right? At Stums, I found Ingress paper twice as thick as the ordinary kind. One can work better on it, but alas, it's white. Would there be any chance of you sending some of that same kind, but the color of unbleached muslin or linen? So what he's asking for is a slightly more beige color, not a white color, but a slightly more creamy color, I think. He says, like a few of the sheets that were in that lot you brought me before, and like those on which the exercises of Fossain are printed. Before beginning to draw on the white paper, one must first wash the whole page with a flat tone. He says, so I've been to The Hague. Perhaps it was the beginning of a renewed and closer acquaintance with Mauve and others. I hope so. A handshake in thought. My warm thanks for your faithful help in this matter. Because of the expenses, perhaps I never would have gone, or at least postponed it. Yours, Vincent. P.S. De Bock is very pleased with the drawings by Millet, which he bought from you. So now we go to September 1881, letter from Vincent to Theo from Eton. And now you're starting to see artworks in every letter, reference in every letter. I'm not terribly fond of this one. It's quite interesting what you can see through the window. Old Man by the Fire is not bad, definitely better than this is pretty good. I must say this picture and the windmills, I would say, are his best so far, in my opinion. That's a pretty good one. Sower is not bad. It's so-so, I guess. Not crazy about the expression on this guy's face. Seems a bit sort of stilted. Anyway, so he says, Dear Theo, though it is only a short time since I wrote to you, I have something more to tell you now. For there has been a change in my drawings, both in the way I set about them and the results. Also, as a consequence of some of the things Mauve has told me, I've started working with live models again. Luckily, I've been able to get several people to sit here for me, including Pitt Kaufman, the laborer. Just kind of getting the gardener and folks that work for his family to sort of sit as models. And he says, careful study and the constant and repeated copying of Bach's exercises off Hussein have given me a better insight into figure drawing. I've learned to measure and to see and to look for the broad outlines so that, thank God, what seemed utterly impossible to me before is slowly becoming possible now. Now, I've got to say, when I look at the figures he draws now, particularly Old Man by the Fire, and I look at some of the figures in his paintings even as late as 1890, small little figures, sometimes in a field, you sort of wonder what kind of went on. Did you forget how to draw figures, or do you just not care? Because sometimes he doesn't put a lot of effort into his human figures when he's drawing landscapes. which seems to diminish the landscape somewhat. Anyway, he goes on to say, by the way, my great-grandfather, when he painted landscapes, they almost never had people in them, which is quite interesting. Houses, yes. Sometimes washing on the line, yes. Sometimes the odd cow or goat or horse, but more often than not, just no people in them. It's quite interesting. Careful study and the constant. Okay, so there's that. Then he says, I've drawn a man with a spade, a digger, 5 times over in a variety of poses, a sower twice, a girl with a broom twice, then a woman in a white cap peeling potatoes, and a shepherd leaning on his crook, and finally an old sick peasant sitting on a chair by the hearth with his head in his hands and his elbows on his knees. And it won't be left at that, of course. Once a few sheep have crossed the bridge, the whole flock follows. Now, the one that he's talking about, the old sick peasant sitting on a chair by the hearth with his head in his hands and his elbows on his knees, that's a picture he would paint or draw repeatedly. He would actually draw it again, I guess, from memory. 7 or 8 years later from the asylum, and he would title that picture, that theme, that concept, At Eternity's Gate, and that is the name that Julian, I can't remember his surname now, but the guy who made At Eternity's Gate, he drew the title from that particular artwork. But this is the first time that he's sketched it right here. Somber subjects. Yeah, it is somber subjects. And so if you're saying his subjects are somber, does that mean he's somber? And if you say it is, well, does he become more or less somber over time? I don't think it does mean he's somber. I think he's trying to capture the human condition. He's trying to capture classical human themes. It's not he's depressed. He's trying to capture a Dickensian interpretation, right? He goes on to say, once a few sheep have crossed the bridge, the whole flock follows. Now I must draw diggers, sowers, men and women at the plough ceaselessly, scrutinize and draw everything that is a part of country life, just as many others have done and are doing. I no longer stand helpless before nature. Okay, let me read that again. It says, I no longer stand helpless before nature like I used to. So through his art, he's getting a sense of connection, proportion, scale, scope, context to where he fits in with his world, with the universe, right? Karina says he doesn't seem to like to draw humans so much. Stephanie says, though I am almost done with my next CrimeCon notes, I'm waiting on my microphone. Wanted to update you. I must tell you, Stephanie, that I asked Lisa to do a part 2 to The Culture's Wrath, and she was like, I've said all I need to say about that, but she said, I do want to talk about Casey Anthony and Laurie Vello, and so maybe the three of us will do something like that quite soon. So we'll see. Okay. He goes on to say, how long is this letter? Quite long. So he kind of goes on to talk about art. And I'm going to skip through some of it, but he says, I'm tremendously anxious to get a woman to pose with a seed basket so as to find a little figure like the one I showed you last spring, in which you can see in the foreground of the first little sketch. So that's quite a strong statement. I'm tremendously anxious to get a woman to pose with a seed basket. And one's got to wonder, is that just him wanting to paint something, or maybe he's a 28-year-old and he is about to fall in love with Key Voss. Has it got something to do with that, right? Okay. So now we go to the 12th of October, 1881. And this is quite I quite like the scene in this particular sketch. It's also not too bad. Definitely not too bad. Okay, 12th October 1881, dear Theo. As the whole family is writing to you again, I too enclose a little note. I certainly hope you are well and will be able to find a half hour to write me again. Now I will tell you what I've been doing since I wrote you last. In the first place, 2 large drawings, crayon and a little sepia, pollard willows, something like the sketch below. By the way, pollard willows are where you sort of cut off the big branches of a tree, you sort of reduce it to sort of like a stub, and then fresh branches grow off from that point, and then they cut back again. And so it almost looks like a decapitated tree with long kind of like porcupine quills coming off it, if that makes sense. That's a pollard willow, and you see that quite often in the Netherlands, and you see it every now and then in some of his art. Then he says, then another one vertical of the road to Deur. That drawing has apparently been lost. I also had a model again a few times, a digger and a basket weaver. And then last week I received from Uncle in Prissenhagen a paint box, which is still very good, certainly good enough to begin on. I'm very glad to have it. So now he's received a box of paints, and guess what he's going to do with it. He says, I'm very happy to get models. I'm also trying to get a horse and a donkey. That thick Ingress paper I mentioned is especially good for painting in watercolor and is much cheaper than any other. Still, I'm not in a hurry for it because I brought a supply from The Hague, but alas, it's plain white. Well, you see, I'm hard at work. Uncle goes to The Hague tomorrow and will perhaps talk over with Mauve the question of my going up to see him again. And now adieu. I've worked very far today and am very tired, but I would not let the letter go without enclosing a word. I hope things are well with you. A handshake in thought, yours sincerely, Vincent. So we go from the 12th of October now to same day, 12th of October, letter from Vincent to Anton van Rappard. And now we get a sense of how he communicates with someone else besides his brother. Dear Rappard, just now received Gavani, Le Homme et l'Oeuvre. Thanks for returning it. In my opinion, Gavani is a very great artist, and certainly also very interesting as a man. Undoubtedly, he now and then did things that were not right, as for instance his behavior towards Thackeray and Dickens, but such things are in the nature of all men. Besides, he seems to have regretted it, for later on he sent drawings to people whom he had not treated kindly enough at first. And Thackeray himself behaved in a similar way toward Balzac, and even went further, I think. But this does not alter the fact that at bottom they were kindred spirits, even if this was not always clear to themselves. Now, I don't know whether he's trying to say something without saying it or say something with saying it, but he's talking about kindred spirits, and I wonder whether he's not trying to suggest to Rappard that they are kindred spirits of a sort. Anyway, he says, when I received the book this morning, I thought, now Rappard will certainly not come himself, otherwise he would have kept it until he arrived. I hardly think it necessary to assure you again that we should all be very happy to have you with us once more, and that we sincerely hope that even if you do not stay long, you will not stay away altogether. So it's kind of seems to be flattering, complimenting, ingratiating himself with Rappard. He wants Rappard to come and visit him. It reminds me a lot of the kind of letters he wrote to Gauguin, where he also came very close to begging. In fact, I think he did write quite a few letters begging Gauguin to join him in all. Here he is writing to Rappard and just saying, dude, we're kindred spirits, not quite saying that, but please come and stay, and you don't have to stay long, just make sure you get here. Then he says, I'm eager to hear something about your plans for the winter. In case you go to Antwerp, Brussels, or Paris, be sure to look us up on your way there. And if you remain in Holland, I shall not give up hope. In winter too, it is beautiful here. And surely we should be able to do something. If not outside, then we could work with the model indoors, for instance, in the house of some peasant or other. Recently, I've been drawing from the model a good deal, for I've found a number of models who are willing enough, and I have all kinds of studies of diggers, sewers, etc., men and women. At present, I'm working a good deal with charcoal and black crayon, and I've also tried sepia and watercolor. Well, I do not venture to say that you will see progress in my drawings, but most certainly you will see a change. Before long, I hope to be able to pay another visit to Mauve to discuss with him the question of whether I should start painting or not. Once started, I shall carry it through, but I want to talk it over with some people before starting. More and more, I'm glad that I've specially set my mind on drawing figures. For most certainly, it indirectly influences landscape drawing because one learns to concentrate. So I can't show you because it won't let me, or will it? Okay. This is a little snippet. It's also quite a nice little sketch that he does inside the letter. It shows that he's definitely getting quite good at what he's doing. It says here, I should have liked to send you a few sketches if I'd had time, but I'm busy with all kinds of things. Later on, however, you will get some. In case you do not stay in Holland, please be sure to let me know your address, for in any case, I shall have quite a few things to write about during the winter. She's even like saying, send me your forwarding address because I'm never going to make contact with you. Then he says, do you mind very much if I keep Carl Roberts' Le Fusain a little while longer? That's the book. Because you know I need it so much as I'm working with charcoal now. But when I go to The Hague, I shall try to get it myself. I should be very much surprised if I did not stay quietly in Etten this winter. At least that is my intention. In no case shall I go abroad, for I have made rather good progress since I came back to Holland. That's true. Not only in drawing, but also in other things. Well, I'm going to toil on here for a bit longer. I've been abroad for so many years in England as well as in France and Belgium that it is high time for me to stay here again for a while. And by that he means stay at home with his parents. Do you know what is so superb these days? The road to the railway station and to Delure with those old pollard willows. You have a sepia of it yourself. I can't tell you how beautiful those trees are just now. I made about 7 large studies of some trunks. I know for sure that if you could come one of these days while the leaves are falling, even if it were only for a week, you would make something beautiful of it. If you care to come, we shall all be delighted. Kind regards from my parents and a handshake in thought from me, and believe me, ever yours, Vincent. So obviously this is autumn and the trees are losing their leaves, and to him it's vivid and beautiful. Okay, which picture should I show you here? So I think this one has actually come up in one of his letters. Anyway, I've seen it before. Sower. This is not bad. This is definitely not too bad. Okay, so he writes here, this is 12 to 15 October, somewhere between those dates, from Vincent to Theo, um, writing from Eton. My dear Theo, I was very pleased to get your letter just now, and as I intended to write to you anyhow in the next day or so, I'm replying right away. I'm so glad you sent the Ingress paper. I still got some left, but not the right color. I was happy to hear what Mr. Tierstick said about my drawings, and certainly no less glad that you saw progress yourself in the sketches I sent you. So jumping to the next paragraph, he writes, the artist always comes up against resistance from nature in the beginning, but if he really takes her seriously, he will not be put off by that opposition. On the contrary, it is all the more incentive to win her over. At heart, nature and the honest draftsman are as one. Nature is most certainly intangible, yet one must come to grips with her and do so with a firm hand. Now, when he talks about nature, coming to grips with nature with a firm hand, it sort of makes one wonder, does he think about women in the same sense? That he must be firm towards a woman? I don't know. Maybe not. But anyway, he says, and having wrestled and struggled with nature for some time now, remember he's referring to nature in the feminine sense. He says, and having wrestled and struggled with nature for some time now, I find her more yielding and submissive. Not that I've got there yet, but no one is further from thinking that than I am. But things are beginning to come more easily. So remember the question that we've been asking, do you think that he struggles with depression? Do you think he feels helpless? Do you think he's frustrated? Look at how long and persistent and determined and how much endurance and resilience he has as an artist, how stubbornly he pursues what he's trying to do. He's not someone who's easily discouraged, it appears. Do you get that? He's not someone who's easily put off what he wants to do. Art is quite a difficult profession in a way. You alone, it's especially difficult when no one's buying your stuff, because you're working hard, you're thinking hard, you're trying to grow, and you are growing, and you're evolving, you're improving. But when you're not selling any of your stuff, it sort of feels like it's all for nothing. It feels like you've been invalidated. It feels like your efforts are not really worth anything, when they, of course, are worth something. I mean, to develop skill, and any artist knows they've improved. The question is, have you improved enough, and what does that mean? And I think one of the things that makes Van Gogh quite amazing is that I think his art was so progressive, so modern, that the art world wasn't really ready for it for, one could argue, 20 years. You could even argue 60 years. It was so progressive that it took a really long time for the actual art world to catch up. Anyway, he goes on to say, the struggle with nature is sometimes a bit like what Shakespeare calls the taming of the shrew, which means wearing down the opposition. And again, I can't help wondering whether there's a part of Van Gogh's mind that's thinking about women in the same way, because he's on the cusp. He's about to fall head over heels with Key Voss. And I kind of get the feeling that he struggled to tame nature, to figure out what he's drawing. He's going to translate in his own mind to the struggle to tame a woman, to tame a woman's heart, to melt her heart. And it's almost like he sees it as a kind of a wrestling match, excuse the pun. Anyway, so he says, the struggle with nature is sometimes a bit like what Shakespeare calls the taming of the shrew, which means wearing down the opposition. In many fields, but especially in drawing, I think that persistence is better than surrender. Again, what does this tell you about his attitude towards life? Persist, don't give up, right? That's something he's felt his whole life, and he doesn't give up. He says, I've come to feel more and more that figure drawing is an especially good thing to do, and that indirectly it also has a good effect on landscape drawing. If one draws a pollard willow as if it were a living being, which after all is what it really is, then the surroundings follow almost by themselves, provided only that one has focused all one's attention on that particular tree and not rested until there was some life in it. Now, I must say that paragraph is so emblematic of Van Gogh. Is basically saying, if you draw a tree like a living being, and he says, well, it is alive, isn't it? He says, then the surroundings will come alive as well. And so literally what's happening here is he's starting to see the world through different eyes. He's starting to see the world not as a flat two-dimensional landscape, not as silhouettes and lines, but something imbued with life. But it's something more than life. It's energy, it's electricity, it's vitality. And although he's not there yet, although he's feeling this and he's seeing this, he's aware of the ebbing, the pulsating life in what he's seeing in front of him. It'll take him quite a few years to realize that to represent what he's talking about, the way to represent what he's talking about will be through color. Color primarily, but also through this impasto technique, this very rapid technique of painting thick paint and these energy lines, right? But primarily color is how he's going to give voice to this, these pulsating impressions of what's in front of him, right? I'll just read that again. He says, I've come to feel more and more that figure drawing is an especially good thing to do. So he goes from drawing people, drawing the limbs of a person's body, arms, fingers, thighs, legs. Now you must remember, I think they even call certain parts of the human body the trunk of a person. But when you go from drawing that to drawing the limbs of a tree, starting to realize, wow, there's actually something in common across all living things. All things have got branches, and trees look like they've got fingers, and some people look like their legs are like the limbs of an old tree or whatever. And we've seen, for example, in the Lord of the Rings, the what do they call it? When you give certain things human qualities, anthropomorphization kind of thing. You see what I'm talking about? And it goes beyond that. You can see hinges and like elbows. And you can see that insects even have hands to hold on to things. And then you start to see that, wow, there's a kind of a basic design in all things. Certain creatures, large and small, all have spines. Certain creatures have got hair, others have got scales, but then people also have fingernails, and that's kind of a scaly thing, and so on and so on and so on. And just seeing the way that life expresses itself in different contexts and in different creatures. He says, if one draws a pollard willow as if it were a living being, which after all it is what it really is, then the surroundings follow almost by themselves, provided only that one has focused all one's attention on that particular tree and not rested until there was some life in it. So he's saying, you've got to try and put life into that tree. You're not just copying the tree. You're not just drawing a tree. You're trying to draw the life in that tree. It's a very different approach. And it's also a really big challenge. How do you do that? I know when I wrote about true crime, I felt I don't want to just gratuitously write about true crime. I also want to touch on the human condition that is resonating with everyone. Why is this case so high profile? What is resonating with us, and what's the message we take out of this? That was how I approached it. It's to see the meaning, the life edifying thing in this tragedy. So it's not just all tragedy. There's also something, there's a cautionary tale that comes out of it. There's something edifying and meaningful that comes out of it. That was always the way that I wanted to approach it. Then how long is this letter? He says, I think he's been in the panorama, and even though he refuses to admit it, that too will have a generally favorable effect on him. I think he's talking about de Bock here. Then he says, I respect your way of dealing with the older and wiser members of your society, whom you have left to their own old age and wisdom, while you yourself have got on with things in your younger and more energetic way. That is true philosophy and makes us act as de Bock and you do when the need arises. It can be said of such philosophy that it is practical as well as, in the way, as Morv says, painting is drawing as well. I filled up my paper, so I shall end and go out for a walk. My warmest thanks for all your efforts on my behalf, a handshake in my thoughts, and believe me, ever yours, Vincent. I did skip out a section there that was just sort of going on a little bit. Now we go from 12th October to about the 15th of October. It's another letter from Vincent to Anton van Rappard. So within days, he writes another letter. So he says, Dear Rappard, in my opinion, your letter must be answered on the spot. In the first place, I want you to know that it interests me very much, more than any other letter I've received from you. I learned more from it than you yourself meant to write down. So again, he's been quite flattering in a way. He says, I learned from it that my friend Rappard has taken a great step forward, or will do so shortly. Why? Oh, it doesn't matter right away, but I have my reasons for believing that you have reached a point of revolution and reform. Within a short time, there will be fire and enthusiasm in you. But for the moment, not another word about it in this letter. But if by chance you should be surprised at what I've told you, I hope to be able to tell you more soon in person. He goes on to say, in the first place, on my parents' behalf, I invite you to come and stay with us one of these days. So that's really what these letters are about, is really trying to urge this guy to come and visit him. So I'm not going to read the rest of this letter. It's quite long, but that's really what this letter is all about. Come and visit. The next letter is on the 2nd of November, 2 weeks later, again to Anton van Rappard. He says, Dear Rappard, thanks for your quick reply. So you soon succeeded in finding rooms and are now living near the academy. With reference to a certain question which I decried at the bottom of your postcard, I want to tell you that far from thinking it stupid of you to go to the aforesaid sanctuary, I think it very wise, blah, 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 blah. In my opinion, if you had not gone, okay, I'm just trying to see where it says, he said, please do not take me for a fanatic or a partisan. Certainly I have the courage to take sides like any other man. At times one is compelled to do so in life. One is compelled to speak one's mind and to give one's opinion candidly and stick to it. Okay, so this is quite interesting. He says, when you're making vigorous studies after the nude, so he's talking about nude portraits, I guess, or nude studies. He says, like the ones you showed me, whether at the academy or somewhere else, when I am drawing potato diggers in a field, then we are doing good things by which we shall make progress. But as I see it, for all that, we must be especially distrustful of ourselves and be on our guard against ourselves as soon as we perceive that we are on the right road. When we must say, let me be very careful, for I'm just the kind of man to spoil things for myself when they seem good, unless I'm careful. It's kind of very weird to see Van Gogh writing in this way, that it's like he's talking about doing nude studies and he's saying, whoa, be careful, right? Let me be very careful, for I'm just the kind of man to spoil things for myself. Then he says, how must we be careful? He says, this I cannot define, but I'm most decidedly of the opinion that in the case I mentioned, being careful is necessary, for from my own bitter experience, through my own sufferings and shame, and this is quite emotional language for him, I have become conscious of what I underlined just now, the fact that my being conscious of my own fallibility. What do you think he's talking about in terms of fallibility? What do you think he's actually getting at? He says, will keep me from making many mistakes, will certainly not prevent my making a great many mistakes after all. But after we fall, we stand up again. Do you think he's talking about art? Do you think he's talking about making mistakes in art? Anyway, he goes on to say, so I think it a very good thing that you're painting from the nude at the academy, just because I am confident that you will not consider yourself righteous like the Pharisees on account of it, nor think those whose views differ from yours insignificant. Your work, far more than your words and expressions, has given me this conviction, and it has grown stronger and stronger. Today I drew another digger, and also since your visit, a boy cutting grass with a sickle, and a man and a woman sitting by the fire besides. This is quite funny. He says, yet I should like to see you draw or paint ordinary people with their clothes on. I shouldn't be surprised if you made a success of it. I often think of that clerk whose portrait you drew during the sermon of the very Reverend and learned Dr. Cum. But since I have not seen any more drawings by you like that one, which I regret, have you been reclaimed by any chance? And are you listening more to the sermon nowadays instead of paying attention to the speaker and his audience? Now, I don't know if you've noticed, he seems to have stopped almost completely talking about God or verses or sermons or anything. You know, it's like it's not even almost present in his letters. It's like he doesn't mention pastors or churches or Bible verses. It's just like gone. It's not there at all. I mean, he does say here something about that, but it's almost like in reference to him drawing nude people. So that's kind of how he's like, wow, should I be doing this? And then the very next thing is he has this weird thing with Kivos. It's almost like Van Rappard drawing people without clothes on reminds him that he himself is a sexual being, and maybe Kivos is as well. Or maybe Kivos, her husband has died, she is kind of ripe or ready or available, right? And it's like, wow, I'm a sexual being. Van Rappard's drawing people without clothes on. We all sexual beings, time to fall in love, kind of thing. Anyway, so that and I mean that is definitely part of the territory. Not of all artists, but certainly of a lot of artists, is painting people and then sometimes painting them in the nude as well. I don't know if you guys remember, I spoke about the guy from Belgium who came to South Africa, and I wrote an article about him. Claude, he was kind of a pastor. He came here to preach, and then he ended up painting the people that were here. He painted quite a lot of African women holding babies, but often topless or whatever. And there was kind of how can I put it? There's a kind of a controversy that farmers and other people kind of got caught up in what he was doing. And there was like a thing of how can I put it? Farmers started becoming interested in, I guess, their laborers and started seeing their laborers as sexual objects, if that's the word, through this pastor or this preacher kind of seeing them in the same way. And that led to, there's a place in the Free State province called Excelsior, and people made a joke because of what was going on there, and they called it Sexcelsior, which is quite funny. But the thing I'm trying to get at is, you had this dude coming from Europe who came here, and he started seeing things in a different way. So he saw donkeys as the donkeys that took Jesus into Jerusalem, and he saw sunflowers as emblematic of God's light on the world or whatever. And he saw all these different things. And one of it was some of the black laborers as like Madonna and child. But I'm just saying there was a aspect to it that was far more sexual, but also kind of more intimate than I guess people had been used to until then. And it just makes me think about what Van Gogh's going through at this point, where he's starting to having a kind of an awakening. His art is having an awakening. You've just seen him talk about the trees alive. Well, now he's having another kind of awakening. And sure enough, in his very next letter, 3rd of November, 1881, this is a really important letter. Dear Theo, there's something on my mind that I want to tell you about. You may perhaps know something of it already, and it will not be news to you. Do you remember this letter? I wanted to let you know that I fell so much in love with Kivos this summer that I can no longer find other words for it than it is just as if Kivos were the closest person to me and I the closest person to Kivos. And these words I spoke to her. So it sounds like he's just done this. He's just said to her, you're the closest person to me and I'm the closest person to you. But when I told her this, she replied that her past and her future remained as one to her and that she could never return my feelings. Can you see how immediately preceding this letter is Rappard's nude studies? So it's almost like a light goes on in Van Gogh's mind or body or whatever, or both. Then he says, then I was in a tremendous dilemma about what to do. Should I resign myself to that never, or consider the matter not yet settled and done with, keep in good heart and not give up? Now, again, you've got to look at, he's making connections. Again, you've got to look at, he's a very intense dude and he gets very emotional, and you might say, is that a suicidal risk factor? The other side of it is, when he ultimately comes out of it, does he fall apart and is he depressed and does he need counseling, or does he kind of get over it? So here's a good example of, he gets caught up in love, he gets very emotional, it's devastating, but does he go on? Right? Does he pick himself up by his bootstraps and go on to live another day, love another person, right? This is a good way to test resilience, is how do you deal with either unrequited love or love that terminates, love that ends, love that doesn't work out. Maybe you do fall in love, but then it doesn't work out. How do you deal with that? And I think one's got to be careful, because you can break up with someone and just not feel anything, or apparently not feel anything, but actually you don't know what's going on. You know, in other words, you're kind of on the rebound, but actually there's a lot of brokenness inside. A little bit like Jerry Maguire, where you sort of can't be alone kind of thing. Anyway, so he goes on to say, And to this day, I do not regret this approach, although I am still up against that no, never, no, or never, no, never. Since then, of course, I've had to put up with quite a few of life's little troubles, which, had they been written about in a book, might well have served to amuse some people, but which, if one experiences them oneself, must be deemed anything but pleasant. So he's saying he's actually going through quite a difficult time. He says, however, to this day, I'm glad that I left the resignation of the how not to do it method to those who have a mind for it, and for myself kept a good heart. So he's saying, although she's rejected me, although I'm not getting what I want, I've kept a good heart. You will you will understand that in a case like this, it is surprisingly difficult to tell what one can, may, and must do. Yet we pick up the scent as we wander about, not as we sit idly by. One of the reasons why I've not written to you about all this before is that my position was so uncertain and unsettled that I was unable to explain it to you. So what this shows is that Van Gogh doesn't necessarily wear his heart on his sleeve. He doesn't tell his brother everything. He does sometimes hold a dimension, even an important dimension, to him. He keeps it to himself. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure if what I think of him having these feelings throughout the whole summer. But if that's true, you can see that basically when he moved back home, Kivos, he would have seen Kivos quite often. She probably posed for him, and he didn't say much about it, and he didn't show pictures of it either. But probably now that he's living at home, he sees her. It's kind of a comfortable, casual situation, and that's the situation in which they meet and things happen, right? Timmy, I don't want to pick you up again. Hey? Okay. Can I lay you down to sleep? There we go. Okay. Let's have a look at some of your comments. Terry says it really does help to draw people clothed after studying them without. Robbie Robbins says he picks himself up and moves on. Karina says he has such a strong life force. He is like a wibble wobble, always getting up afterwards. Not there, it says he wrote with defiant determination to pursue key. So then he talks about the only one to say to me, and that very informally and privately, that there really might be a chance for me if I worked hard and made progress, was someone from whom I least expected it, Uncle Cent. He was pleased with the way in which I reacted to Key's never, no, never, that is, not making heavy weather of it, but taking it in quite good humor, and said, for instance, don't give grist to the never, no, never mills, which Key has set up. I wish her all the best, but I rather hope those mills will go bankrupt. So it seems like he kind of gets a bit of support from an uncle, but it's kind of like, it's good to see that you're not very brokenhearted. I don't know if he's necessarily saying, keep trying. He says, similarly, I didn't take it amiss when Uncle Stricker said that there was the danger that I might be severing friendly relationships and old ties. This is a lot more serious. His uncle saying, this could jeopardize your relationships with family members, right? Then he says, I said that in my view, the real issue, far from severing old ties, was to see if the old ones could not be renewed where they were in need of repair. Did I say nude? Could not be renewed where they were in need of repair. Anyway, that is what I hope to go on doing, and cast out despondency and gloom, meanwhile working hard, and ever since I met her, I've been getting on much better with my work. So he's almost relating his passion, his work ethic to the feelings he has for her. He's also saying that despite feeling despondent, he's cast it out and he's working hard. This is also giving you an idea of how he copes with stress and frustration and despondency, is he works hard. And that is something that he would do throughout 1888, 1889, 1890. You can argue that because he wasn't particularly happy, because he was quite lonely, because he wasn't getting the acceptance from people that he liked, that he wanted, that it made him spend more time with his art and painting. Does that make sense? He says, I told you that the position has now become more clear-cut. First, Key says never, no, never, and then I have the feeling that I'm going to have an immense amount of difficulty with the older people who consider the matter settled and done with now and will try to force me to drop it. So you can see he's held quite a lot back from Theo. For the time being, however, I think they'll go about it very gently, keeping me dangling and fobbing me off with fair words until Uncle and Aunt Stricker's big celebration in December is over, their silver wedding anniversary. I fear they will be taking measures to get rid of me. Forgive me for expressing myself somewhat harshly in order to make the position clear to you. I admit that the colors are somewhat glaring and the lines somewhat starkly drawn, but that will give you a clearer insight into the affair than if I were to beat about the bush. So do not suspect me of lacking in respect for the older people. So can you see in what a way, even when he's writing about matters of the heart, even when he's writing about very emotional subjects, even when it's like very fraught scenarios that are taking place, what his relatives think of him, is still measured, is still lucid, is still very effective in the way he writes about it, is able to communicate quite, how can I put it, with what looks like amazing perspective and even maturity, right? His writing isn't all over the place. It's quite mature and sensible. And I mean, here he obviously is feeling emotional. He says, I do believe that they are positively against it, and there he's got emphasis, meaning the relationship. And I wanted to make that clear to you. They will try to make sure that Key and I neither see or speak or write to each other, because they know very well that if we saw, spoke, or wrote to each other, there would be a chance of Key changing her mind. Key herself thinks she will never change her mind. The older people are trying to convince me that she cannot change it, and yet they fear such a change. It's kind of a good point in a way. Although the flip side is that if she said no, maybe you should just respect that. It is, a little bit like, is the cup half full? Van Gogh seems to kind of be going, well, if I persist and I'm allowed to persist, isn't it just a matter of time before she gives in to me? And there's an aspect to that that's maybe quite romantic and quite charming, but there's another aspect to that that's pretty creepy and stalkerish, right? Anyway, he says, the older people will change their minds about this affair, not when Key changes her attitude, but when I become somebody who earns at least 1,000 guilders a year. I think that is a very interesting and kind of bitter assessment, where he says that. He's kind of saying, the reason why they don't think I'm good enough is I'm not worth enough. If I was a rich dude, they'd be like, thumbs up. Guys, I'm struggling a little bit. I think I've got a bit of a post-nasal drip, and my water is about finished. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to go on for much longer. but this is a really important sentence. Stephanie says, I have the feeling Key might have felt the ladder creepy. Yeah. So he's kind of feeling that the reason he's being discriminated against is it's because he's not rich, which I think may be true, but I think the other part that may be true is also maybe she wouldn't have been interested anyway, right? As Stephanie says, he's not accepting boundaries. True Jedi Forever says, I wonder how much that would be in today's money. He says, once again, forgive me the hard contours with which I'm outlining matters. So even though he's talking about this, he hasn't lost his decorum with his brother. He says, forgive me for what I'm saying. He says, if I receive a little sympathy from the older ones, I believe that some of the younger ones will be able to understand my position. So there I think he's talking about his siblings and the younger people in the family. You may, Theo, hear it said of me that I want to force things and expressions like that. Yet everyone knows how senseless force is in love. No, nothing is further from my thoughts. But it is neither unfair nor unreasonable to wish that Key and I, instead of not being allowed any contact with each other, might see, speak, or write to each other so that we could come to know each other better and even be able to tell whether or not we are suited to one another. So you can kind of imagine how they were seeing one another in a casual capacity, and he develops feelings for her only to discover that she doesn't feel the same way, and everyone's upset. And the question is, didn't this happen with Dr. Gachet? Didn't exactly the same thing happen there? Sorry. So I think I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop here. So we'll continue with this letter about love and love and love. In number 14, I really would have liked to have gotten to the end of 1881, but I know there are a lot of letters in November and December. So I'm going to put a link in chat. I haven't forgotten about this. And it is a really amazing article by Martin Bailey. And the title is New Research Sheds Light on Van Gogh's Problems with Gauguin as Revealed by the Paintings of Their Favorite Chairs. So the part to emphasize here is that this new research shows that early on, bear in mind, Van Gogh's furniture was kept from the Yellow House. So Gauguin's chair and Van Gogh's chair were kept. And then there were exhibitions, and this is after Van Gogh died. There were exhibitions, and you never saw Gauguin's chair, either the painting of it or the actual chair. And so people were asking about that, like, what's that all about? So quoting from the article, it says here, the public's first opportunity, this is quoting from the article, from Martin Bailey's article, the public's first opportunity to see Van Gogh's chair came in 1905. That's 15 years after he died, when Jo Bonga, that is Theo's wife, now she's a widow, lent it to a major retrospective of the artist's work in Amsterdam. It comprised nearly 500 works. It is still the largest Van Gogh show ever held. And this is the part that's really interesting. Although most of the important family paintings were lent, Gauguin's chair was not included. Why do you think that is? Gauguin's chair was not included. And the part that I want to emphasize is just that one has the impression that Joe purposefully held back the art related to Gauguin because she didn't like him, right? The first time this was released was after she died. So while she was alive, she didn't include it in exhibitions. That's quite a strong statement, right? That's quite a strong statement. And what I find quite interesting, and you guys are free to read this article at your leisure, but what is really interesting is let me just see if I can find it here. It was not until 1928 that Gauguin's chair was first publicly exhibited. This was 3 years after Joe's death, when the collection was managed by his son, Vincent Willem. So she obviously didn't want it to be part of the exhibition. And one wonders then, what was her personal knowledge of Gauguin that she didn't approve? And so here's the expert artistic assessment of the answer to that. Van Tilburg believes that Bonga resented Gauguin because of his friend's suicide, and he had tried to claim credit for Van Gogh's artistic innovations. So that's what the one art expert says. So I'm just going to put that there. Van Tilburg believes that Joe resented Gauguin because after Vincent's suicide, he tried to claim credit for Van Gogh's artistic innovations. I don't think that's why she didn't like Gauguin. I don't think it's because Gauguin said, I gave Vincent the idea to paint like that or whatever. I don't think that's the reason. Interestingly, Martin Bailey then volunteers and he says, one can also speculate that she partly blamed Gauguin for Van Gogh's tragic self-mutilation. Well, that I think is much closer to the truth, right? So Van Tilburg sort of moves the scale a little bit and he says, I think Joe didn't like Gauguin because he wasn't very nice and he wasn't very gracious and he wasn't very... Bear in mind, Gauguin didn't even attend Vincent's funeral, right? He wasn't even at the funeral and he was in France, right? Now, so I don't think it's that he said something about this is my idea or whatever. I don't think it's something as silly as that. I think it is, well, Stephanie says Gauguin was not a true friend. I think Martin Bailey's heading in the right direction where he says one can speculate that Joe partly blamed Gauguin for Van Gogh's tragic self-mutilation. I would take it a lot further. In The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, the book that I wrote, I said that I don't actually think Van Gogh cut off his ear. I believe that Gauguin cut it off, that they had an argument. Maybe Vincent was in the wrong, maybe Vincent was unhinged, but they had an argument and Gauguin actually sliced off his ear with a sword, which we know that he had. We know that Gauguin also abandoned Vincent, like in the middle of all this. It wasn't like he was supportive of him. Like the day that he almost died, Gauguin was out of there, right? We know that they were arguing because Vincent van Gogh wrote that they were arguing. And we also know that Gauguin went from that to witnessing a execution in Paris where someone was beheaded. So it feels like Gauguin was, I don't know what was going on with him, but isn't it possible that Theo told Joe what had actually really happened, and they kept it kind of a secret amongst themselves, that Gauguin and Vincent had fought, but Vincent had taken the blame basically for what had happened. Or put it in another way, he didn't blame, we didn't accuse Gauguin for what happened. And Joe then felt, there's no way I'm going to give this dude any glory. He's a, you know what I mean? I'm not going to, I don't like this guy. He's a, do you see where I'm coming from? I don't think she would do that if it was just something silly or something small. I think it's a big thing. So that's why I think what Theo said to Joe was something that they privately knew, but they weren't going to tell anyone because they were in a financial and business relationship with Gauguin. Does that make sense? So I do think that Stephanie says, yes, that would make sense. So I do think that is a very interesting thing that has emerged just in the last very recent time. The fact that Joe didn't like Gauguin and she actually held a grudge, and she seemed like quite a sweet lady. She was kind to Dr. Gachet. She gave him the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, so definitely quite interesting. Here's even a very old article from 1932. The artist who painted a vacant chair. I do recommend that you read this whole article when you've got some time. I'm going to tap out. My voice is just not doing very great. Yeah, so I did want to get a bit further, but hopefully I can cover more ground next time. So thanks, guys, for joining me. I know it was a bit of an unusual time. I was hoping to see Bria, but maybe next time. Good to see the mods. Paddy says, we'll do our homework, Nick. That's good to hear. Karina, good to see you here. I hope you're doing better. Robbie as well, good to see you. But thanks a lot for members who are here. And let's just finish up by going to the votes. I see 58 people have voted. Almost 70% of you say, does Van Gogh exhibit signs of depression in his letters? I've got to side with the 14% who say not so far. So I would definitely not say yes, and I would definitely not say no. I would either say no or not so far, but certainly I would at this point say not so far. I think there's a little bit of depression, and who can blame him, during the aftermath of the ear and when he's in the asylum, but not like, I don't know, it's not, if he does have depression, it's not debilitating for a very, very long time. I think it's maybe for a month at the most, which in terms of depression isn't really that long. And then he comes out of it. So I would say not so far, which is by far the minority of what you guys are saying there. And I think that's a little bit of it's my opinion, of course, and I could be wrong, but I think it's a little bit of a bias of people where you immediately think of Van Gogh and you think depression because you think you know the end result. Well, if he committed suicide, he had to have been depressed. I don't see signs of that. And that's why I want us to, every letter we go through, is there a sign of that depression? Are there risk factors? And so now we're dealing with a really important area, which is his love life? How does he recover from a broken heart? Well, I think better than many. I'm not saying he's a model by any means, but he certainly doesn't fall to pieces either. Okay, so that is it. Also, thanks for the super chats. The couple of you who made contributions, thanks for that. Not there, it says thank you. Karina says take good care of yourself. Spirit of 1776 says ear must have been quite inflamed and painful. Well, what was left of it, most of it wasn't there. Karina says it was so very wonderful to be here again. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it and glad you're happy. Stephanie says the letters from today, no. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, Stephanie says wonderful to have you, Karina. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I'll see you guys again on Wednesday, probably a little bit later than now, probably closer to 4 or 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Yeah, probably around there, but I'll let you guys know. Was there anything else I meant to say? Yeah, so we basically want to try and get to where he starts painting the weavers. That's really interesting, and that's something I really want to impress on you guys, because in a weird way, the discovery he makes painting the weavers kind of, you could kind of argue changes art history. You could kind of argue that when he's watching the weavers and painting them, he comes upon a discovery that not only changes his life, but changes art history. It's like a spark that just changes everything. And I think if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're in for a big surprise. It's going to be very interesting. Oh, so I just want to wish those of you who are, I think you've still got the whole afternoon, Sunday afternoon to enjoy. Those of you in the States, have a great Sunday afternoon. Thanks for joining me here at an unusual time, and I'll see you guys next time. I must say, I think the previous Van Gogh that I did got over 1,200 views, and there was a time where these episodes only got 300 views. So not sure what's going on. Feels like crazy things are happening, but I'll take it. Thanks, Stephanie. I want to watch the Criterium de Dufana and then go to bed. But yeah, my voice seems to kind of be okay now. But Karina says, I agree with Nick and many of you said, okay. Patty says, these seminars with Nick are the best. Okay, well, Timmy says good night. And enjoy the rest of your weekends and have a good week. And I'll see you guys next time. Take care. Ciao. The sun just came out.